Carol sat at her kitchen table with a stack of papers she didn't fully understand. Tax forms, penalty notices, a letter about early withdrawal fees on a retirement account that no longer existed. The house was gone. The savings were gone. And the man she had spent years planning a future with had never existed at all. She was in her 60s, starting over with almost nothing, and she was still paying the government for money she no longer had, penalties triggered by the very act of giving it all away. To protect her privacy, we're calling her Carol. That isn't her real name, but every detail of what happened to her is true, drawn from federal court records and the statements prosecutors filed at sentencing. To understand how she ended up at that kitchen table, we have to go back to the year after her husband died. Carol had been married for over 3 decades. Her husband passed after a long illness, the kind that gives you time to prepare and somehow never actually prepares you for anything. When he was gone, the house felt too quiet in a way she hadn't expected. Her kids had their own families, their own lives, careers, and children of their own, and they called when they could. But the day-to-day silence of the house was hers alone to sit with. She wasn't desperate or naive. She had worked for years, managed a household budget, raised a family, made decisions large and small for decades. She was, by any reasonable measure, a capable and intelligent woman. But she was lonely in a specific, aching way that only someone who has lost a long marriage can really describe. The kind of loneliness that isn't about being alone in a room, but about no longer having a person whose day you're a part of. A friend suggested she try an online dating site, just to have someone to talk to. Carol wasn't looking for a whirlwind romance. She wasn't looking to replace her husband. She just didn't want to eat dinner alone every night for the rest of her life. And she thought maybe there was a version of companionship out there that didn't require starting completely over. She made a profile, uploaded a few photos, and answered some messages from men who didn't hold her attention for long. She was patient about it. She wasn't in a hurry. That's how she came across a profile that would come to call itself Giovanni. The man behind the profile was not named Giovanni. His real name was Franklin Ikechukwu Nwadialo, and at the time he first messaged Carol, he had already been running versions of this same con for over a decade, operating from outside the United States, using dating platforms like Match, Zusk, and Christian Cafe to find women who matched a very specific profile. Older, often widowed or divorced, financially established enough to have something worth taking. He used stolen or fabricated photos to build the persona, a handsome, well-spoken man with a steady job and a story that made him seem grounded rather than suspicious. He told Carol he was a member of the military, currently deployed overseas. It was the perfect excuse, and it's worth noticing just how well built it was. It explained why they could never meet in person. It explained why his phone calls sometimes cut out mid-sentence, why his access to email was inconsistent, why there might be long gaps between messages followed by a burst of attentive catching up. Instead of reading as evasive, all of it read as noble. He wasn't avoiding her. He was serving his country, and the distance between them wasn't a red flag. It was simply the cost of loving someone who put duty first. It gave the relationship an ache of longing that felt romantic instead of suspicious, and it meant that from the very beginning, every unanswered question about his identity already had an acceptable answer waiting for it. For the first few weeks, there was nothing to protect against, because nothing was being asked of her. Giovanni was attentive in a way that felt rare. He asked about her late husband, her children, the small textures of her day, and he remembered the details she gave him, bringing them up again days or weeks later in a way that felt like genuine care rather than performance. He told her about his own life, or the life he had invented for the occasion, a father who had passed away, a son back home he was working hard to put through school. He mirrored her grief with grief of his own, positioning himself not as someone trying to fix her sadness, but as someone who understood it from the inside, which made her feel, for the first time in a long time, truly seen by another person, rather than simply being handled gently the way people handle a widow. Weeks turned into months, and the messages turned into daily calls, long ones, the kind that fill the exact hours of the evening that used to belong to a marriage. He talked about the future in a soft, unhurried way, about the day his deployment would finally end and they could be together in person, build a life, maybe travel somewhere neither of them had been. He never rushed her toward money, not at first. He let the relationship deepen entirely on its own terms for a long stretch of time, which, in hindsight, was itself part of the design. The financial requests, when they came, would come later, dressed up as a crisis rather than a request, arriving inside a bond that already felt solid enough to survive being tested. The first ask was small, and it came wrapped in an emergency rather than presented as a favor. He told her he had gotten into trouble with his military command, some kind of fine, tied to having revealed his location to her during one of their calls. In cases connected to this same scheme, that fine reportedly reached as high as $150,000. It wasn't framed as her giving him money outright. It was framed as her helping him out of a jam that was, in a strange and almost flattering way, partly caused by how much he cared about staying in touch with her. Guilt and affection were fused together in a single request, which made it very hard to say no. Later there would be other reasons, each one distinct enough to feel like its own isolated situation, rather than part of a pattern. He needed to move money tied to his father's death. He offered to invest funds on her behalf, positioning himself not as someone asking for help, but as someone looking out for her financial future, a partner managing their shared prosperity rather than draining it. He needed assistance with his son's school tuition. Each request had its own story, its own sense of urgency, and its own believable shape. And because they were spread out and varied, none of them, taken alone, looked like the beginning of a pattern that would eventually cost her everything. Here's why it worked, and it's worth slowing down on this part, because the mechanics matter more than the story. Nwadiala wasn't improvising. Investigators would later describe this as a scheme he'd run for roughly 15 years, refined against victim after victim. He specifically targeted older people who were widowed or divorced, people who had both financial resources and a specific kind of emotional opening that comes from losing a spouse or a marriage. The military cover story did two things at once. It explained his physical absence in a way that felt honorable rather than evasive, and it created a built-in excuse for financial emergencies, since military bureaucracy is something most civilians don't fully understand and won't question closely. The relationship moved slowly enough that each individual request felt small and reasonable in context, never a stranger asking for money, but a partner asking for help with a specific, temporary problem. And because the emotional connection had been built first, over months, the financial requests arrived inside a relationship that already felt real. She wasn't sending money to a man she'd just met online. She was helping someone she loved through a hard time. That distinction is the entire mechanism the scam depends on. There was also an isolating effect that built quietly in the background. As the relationship deepened, and as the requests for money continued, victims in cases like this often pull back from family, partly out of the private shame of realizing how much they've given, and partly because the version of events they'd need to explain to a skeptical adult child sounds implausible even to themselves. The prosecutor on this case would later describe the harm to victims as going beyond money entirely, pointing to feelings of shame, depression, and a sense of being cut off from their own families as the deception dragged on. Carol kept going. The requests escalated over time, and so did her willingness to meet them, because by that point, walking away would have meant admitting to herself that the last year or two of her emotional life had been built on nothing at all. That is a very hard thing for anyone to admit, and it's harder still for someone who has already lost a spouse and doesn't want to lose the sense that she can still be loved. She liquidated retirement accounts that had taken her husband and her decades to build. She took out loans against her home. Eventually, she sold the house itself, the house she had raised her children in, and sent the proceeds to a man overseas she had never once met in person, still believing that on the other side of his deployment, whenever that turned out to be, they would finally be together. She was not alone in this. Nwadialo ran multiple versions of this same persona simultaneously, across different platforms and different women, targeting at least 8 known victims, and pulling in more than $3.5 million total over the life of the scheme. One of those women stayed in what she believed was a committed 3-year relationship with him before federal investigators were the ones to tell her the truth. 3 years of daily calls, of imagined future plans, of a man who never existed in the way she thought he did, ended not with a breakup or a slow fade, but with an FBI agent sitting her down and explaining that Giovanni, in every version she had known him, was a fabrication built to extract money from her. What none of the victims knew while it was happening was that they were each a piece of a much larger pattern the FBI was already building a case around. Investigators pieced the scheme together from financial records and wire transfer trails that, followed far enough, all pointed back toward the same operation. Some of it likely came together as family members, noticing unexplained withdrawals or a parent's growing evasiveness about a new relationship, started asking harder questions than the victims themselves were in a position to ask. Once one thread was pulled, the pattern across multiple victims and multiple states became visible in a way it never could have been from inside any single relationship. By the time investigators had assembled enough evidence, they had a clear picture of a scheme that had run for well over a decade, operated largely from outside the country, using multiple aliases built around the same core persona. Nwadialo was indicted in December 2023 on 14 counts of wire fraud connected to the scheme. He wasn't arrested overseas, which is often where cases like this stall out for good, beyond the practical reach of American law enforcement. Instead, he was arrested at an airport in Texas in 2024 when he traveled to the United States himself, walking directly into the jurisdiction that had already spent years building a case against him. In May 2026, Nwadialo was sentenced in federal court in Tacoma, Washington, to 5 years in prison. The judge overseeing the case didn't soften her language about the scope of the damage. She described the crime as devastating, and said it wasn't an exaggeration to say that lives had been ruined, not only in the financial sense, but through the shame, depression, and isolation from family that the victims endured over the course of these relationships. The first assistant U.S. attorney handling the case made a similar point outside the courtroom, noting that Nwadialo had preyed specifically on people already suffering the loss of loved ones or other heartbreak, and that for roughly 15 years he had upended the lives of people he had never once met, inventing story after story, including at one point claiming to run a charitable organization for autistic children, simply to gain victims' trust and their money. Prosecutors who had pushed for the 5-year sentence laid out in their filings how, for over 15 years, Nwadialo and the people working with him had targeted older, often widowed or divorced individuals with savings, convincing them they had found real romantic partners purely for financial gain. They pointed specifically to Carol's situation in their sentencing memo, a widow who believed she had found love again after her husband's death, only to lose her home and life savings, and who, even after the conviction, continued to deal with taxes, fees, and penalties from having liquidated everything she owned to help a man who never existed. Prosecutors were blunt in their assessment that victims like her may never fully recover, financially or otherwise, no matter how much time passes.